you wanted to, yeah, to start the slideshow, that would be great. Cool. And did you started recording, Kateri? Sorry.
Sorry, it was hard to find unmute there. Yes, you're on.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure. I couldn't tell based on my screen. Awesome. So thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody for being present. And today we're essentially going to have some conversations around how to use your school's food waste for effective composting. My name is Liana. I welcome any and all pronouns. And I am existing in and among taken ancestral lands and waters of TIWA and Taos Nations. That is where I'm from. I've been a grower for over 20 years and an experiential educator for about 18. And my very first position ever was specifically on food waste and food waste redistribution. So pretty exciting. Just a sec.
Hey, Megan, glad you're here.
Hey, what's up? Good to see you.
You too. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, these have been really good to see and be able to catch up on too.
Awesome. Liana, we have one more person in the room. Megan Joe is here.
Awesome. Hi, Megan. Thanks so much for joining.
Hi, good afternoon. Excited to
yeah.
This.
Very cool. So yeah, just doing a little bit of an introduction and wanted to sort of invite y'all to reflect on the lands and the waters that y'all are on. Just shared a little bit myself. And if you want to drop that in the chat or share it aloud, that'd be great. Go to the next slide, please. And yeah, in the chat or aloud, whatever feels good to y'all. So your name, your pronouns, the place that you're at, and then any wants or needs y'all have for this session.
My name is Kateri Sava. On TIWA lands, TIWA speaking peoples. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm excited to be here with y'all. I have a cactus wren that is in the garden with us, right in front of me, eating all of the roaches around. So my friend is with us, and I'll pass it to either Susan or Megan.
Hi there, I'm Susan Shapul, and she, her are my pronouns, and I am at Wilson Middle School right now in my classroom right outside, or right at the other side of the garden. And I think I am learning a lot about the fact that this land is TIWA land, and I need to learn more about that. So, so I guess I'll stop there. Thanks.
Hey everyone, my name is Megan. I'm trying to move it real quick. She, her, hers. I am at my mom's place right now, working, finishing up the day here. And from the session, I think maybe some ideas around policy, school policy for implementing a compost kind of program into the school. As some of you know, I'm with the UNM Community Engagement Center, and our initiative right now with NACA Inspired Schools Network is to start an elementary school in the International District charter school. So one of our main programs will be food as medicine, and place-based learning with that. So this conference has been super helpful with like getting ideas and resources. So yeah, pretty much out of the session, anything that could help us with our design planning around it too would be super helpful. Yeah, so thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. And
Yeah.
also, I just wanted to shout out the New Mexico Grown conference is happening now, and they're talking a lot about like not only I haven't seen much on composting, but they're definitely talking about procurement and how to link the garden and stuff to the cafeteria. So I could put that in the chat. Sorry, Liana. I'm trying to.
No, you're great. How about it? Wait, is there more? Or you shared all you wanted to, Kateri?
Oh, I'm muted. Shoot, sorry. Anyways, yeah, that was all I had to say. So I'll start sharing the.
Cool. Thank you so much. Cool. So sorry, I'm having, just full disclosure, I just had a little chicken drama unexpectedly. So I'm trying to sort of work that out and be present. So I apologize if I seem a little distracted. Great. So our next slide is basically sort of the flow of our conversation. So we'll go through the basics of composting, sort of why, the what, and how behind it. I'm sure folks are familiar, and I'm just a big fan of sort of like, let's have a sort of a relative space that we're all sort of moving from. And I also just want to really acknowledge that there's probably a ton of knowledge in this room, and I like welcome shares and questions and inquiry and all that kind of stuff aloud or in the chat, whatever feels comfortable. And I'm just sort of sharing from my own version of like knowledge and messy spaces and all those kinds of things, learned and growing. And then we'll move into methods of composting, so various considerations and ways to compost. And then last but not least, sort of the overall emphasis of like, how do we apply this in school settings, or what are some of the ways and some of the considerations in supporting those connections. Next slide, please. And yeah, please feel free to sort of chime in at any moment if you have any questions or concerns. We're a small group, so we should take advantage of that. So yeah, composting, there's a lot of different definitions of what this is. Usually how folks sort of differentiate it is that composting is a very on purpose motion for folks to encourage decay and decomposition so that we can sort of build or support soils. And composting occurs in aquatic environments too, but we're not going to talk about that at all today. So we're going to stick to the soil. But also the history of composting is very vast and very similar to the vast majority of history, where there's a strong history of indigenous origination, and then a lot of appropriation through colonization, as well as labor exploitation, because compost was one of the many ways up until World War II that we increased our capacity to grow food. So composting was this way to sort of expedite the process of food production, and thereby really increasing food systems, the sizes of food systems, the need for labor. So it has connections to slavery. It has connections to taking and occupying indigenous lands and also enslaving those folks. So big history worth acknowledging. I wanted to share a couple of resources, so I will drop these in the chat box for y'all. These are just if you want to dive a little deeper into them. And basically what we're looking at is the system deeply indigenized with sort of capitalized on by various communities, various societies, and then we bump into World War II, and as a result of World War II, again with like giving a very like sort of a weak history, but essentially there was a lot of byproducts from World War II that we then decided to sort of put into increasing fertility of our farm. So we went from being sort of compost dependent to very much like chemical and primarily like inorganic chemicals or chemical compounds that otherwise were not found sort of in nature or on Earth prior to the war. Yeah, and so that first article is sort of the history of composting, and then this other link that I hope came up is a really cool article from a tribal waste journal specifically about composting on large scales within a tribal system. Next slide, please. So composting is rad. I feel like of all the least complicated things we can do to like take better care, it feels like one of those least complicated or just incredibly beneficial, depending on the stats you're reading. But overall, about 40% of our waste is food waste, and so this is from production, this is post supply, this is all this stuff but there's so much waste, and so much of that waste is food, and I'm sure we all know this, and so it is really a great way to reduce that waste, especially when it's happening on large scales. And I feel like it sort of shows up in cities and urban areas that have compost involved. I feel like it shows up a lot of the time similarly to where like the recycle bin outgrows the trash bin, and then the compost bin outgrows like recycle. Like the more that we realize how much we are wasting, the more we sort of realize that the stuff that actually has no place to go is very minimal, and we have all this other stuff that can be very beneficial. So it keeps the water, it like maintains soil, it helps with carbon sequestration. This is one of like the biggest things is as we are sort of allowing things to decompose or supporting things in decomposition, it does indeed maintain the carbon, and the top 3 feet of our soil is exceptional at that. Reduces waste. We don't need as much synthetic. I think we never need
Liana, I can't hear you. Is that just me?
Unable to hear either.
No. Okay.
Oh, did I freeze up?
Oh, now you're back.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Sure.
Cool.
You said we don't. Last thing I heard was we don't even need synthetic fertilizers.
Perfect. So yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so compost is primarily organic material, meaning that it's anything that was once living. So this can be strongly carbon-based or strongly nitrogen-based. Most once living or living things have this already. And so that can be, there's a list of examples, but leaves, manures, municipal organic waste, there's this chart right there, yada, yada. Next slide, please. So organic material and then decomposers. So we're sort of generating a habitat, and then we're encouraging the decomposers that already exist in there to go to town. And this is just an example of a soil food web on the left, and on the right is sort of a lovely, you know, if compost instantaneously at a line turned into compost from that food waste. But these are many, and definitely not all of the organisms that contribute to decomposition. And we, in a lot of like experiential education circles, we like to use the FFBI, our decomposers, so fire, fungus, bacteria, and insects. Fire, while not being living, very much contributes to decomposition. It's, you know, it's essentially a chemical form of decomposition, or encourages chemical forms of decomposition. And then fungus being mycelia, and all of the various versions. And then, of course, a mushroom being the fruiting body that sort of encourages it to make more of itself, and the bacteria, what most of us are comprised of, and then insects, who are sort of higher up on the food chain. I think some of my favorite fun facts for youth in this context, as I like to share, there's often a lot of like ooey gooey around bacteria especially, and I like to share that like 10% of our body weight is comprised of microorganisms. So that's always one I like to, and if I have somebody, I'll usually talk about myself, but like, I weigh 150 pounds. That means 15 pounds of me is that, like that's 2 babies kind of a thing. So that's a nice one to drop into them. But yes, decomposers meets organic material. We are working towards compost. Next slide, please. And so there's different kinds of compost, and this is by no means a compiled list. And also this is totally a chart that I borrowed because I feel like people explain this in so many different ways. But basically we have cold composting, which can also be referred to as anaerobic composting. So we're not encouraging oxygen. This is usually more of a fermentation process and has a lot of complexity. We probably won't talk very much about cold composting today. It is typically a slower process. You can usually compost more things in cold composting. But I would also beg to differ that for hot composting, but that's, between me and science. And then hot composting typically is going to go quite rapidly, requires like a certain mix of materials like we're sort of talking about. And then also we are typically trying to achieve a certain temperature. And hot composting can really range from sort of like a warm 75 to 80 to like, there's folks who are trying to really have thermophilic organisms, meaning they want like 110 plus degree compost heaps. And all of those things are great. Sort of the sterility of the pile or the sterility of the material increases with hot composting. The same things can be achieved by just like time. So I want to emphasize that also. Vermicomposting is a sort of happy in between. Vermicomposting, you're typically making a habitat for worms to grow and thrive. And in that instance, those worms are typically doing a lot of the digestion. Any questions there? Cool. Okay. Next slide. Thank you, Kateri, mind reader. So basically we'll hear a lot of the times in hot composting, which is most of what we'll sort of be referring, we're looking for carbon-rich and nitrogen-rich materials. Of course, like all organisms have carbon and nitrogen. I typically sort of think of these things as being like really dead, or this is how I describe to like younger folks or folks that aren't super familiar. Like carbon materials are like, they're really dead, they've lost the green, there's no photosynthetic anything sort of left to them. And so there's a bunch of carbon materials listed there, and then we have nitrogen materials. So green materials, sort of freshly dead is how I like to think of it, or was literally recently living or is slowly decomposing. And so that sort of combination, when we have an ideal carbon nitrogen ratio, which there's lots of considerations and variables that alter that, but that is typically what's going to generate the ideal habitat for our microorganisms, for our soil biota. Next slide, please. And so as I sort of described to you before, this chart's kind of neato because it's just sort of showing you the ratio. This is like what a lot of folks like to use. And they are, so ideally we're going to want to have something that's sort of 30-1 as far as a carbon ratio is concerned. Maybe you're a math person. I really struggle with math, but typically if you are composting, in my experience, if you're composting in a semi-arid region or arid, which is where most of us are, I would almost guarantee there's never enough green in your pile. There's almost always too much brown. So if it's not I guess I'm going to say turning, if it's not turning into something that looks like a rich soil, it's typically because there's a lack of nitrogenous or green material. This is where composting with food scraps is amazing, because if you look at this chart, 10:1 is the ratio for veggie scraps. I mean, it is profound how much nitrogen there is in food scraps, and I'll share more on that later, but that's just another reason to do it. I think a lot of the time, most of us have piles that are very much like overloaded with brown material. Also totally fine. It will eventually break down, but that green, that nitrogen, is usually what we're lacking, as well as moisture, and we'll address that a little more later. The more that we can sort of like add that nitrogen in, the better. So that's usually fresh manures and food scraps, I find sort of the highest in nitrogen. Next slide, please. So various methods of compost. There's so many ways and so many systems, and just some regional considerations. Yep, you were great, Kateri. The next slide is fine. Thank you. Some regional considerations. So I always go to this sort of habitat, like in this instance, I'm dealing with soil. So I'm like, what kind of soil am I dealing with? Because typically you are going to have a subsoil that you're putting your pile on. Most of us aren't enclosing, or ideally we're not enclosing our compost. What is the air quality? Is it, and that can be like, is it windy? Is it not windy? Is it dead air? Is it in the ground? And then water, do I have water resources? Is it raining much? Is it a place where it might snow? Is there no water? Is the water draining into my pile? Is the water draining out of my pile? Am I covering my pile? So water is in there. And then sun, how much exposure? Light, I'm not a huge fan of putting compost heaps in direct sun or direct full sun, but sun is definitely something. But things like shade can really support your pile. So thinking about those, this sort of sun aspect, because it can be sterilizing to some of the life that wants to thrive in there. And then what kind of space are you using? A lot of this, I think the space conversation, especially in institutions, is a lot about like, who is it in proximity to? Like, if a smell comes, where is it going to? Or if an animal comes, where is it arriving to? And so that sort of segues into like desirable and less desirable organisms. We want to encourage the microbiota. We want to sort of keep out the macrobiota, like our friend the raccoon or the prairie dogs, or sorry, y'all don't have prairie dogs, gophers, or like those kinds of things. And then climates and microclimates. This is just great for us to consider that we all live in a climate, and there is an enormous amount of climate variation in this region, to the north, to the east, to the south, to the west, and just understanding how those climates and microclimates work is going to help you sort of read how much water am I needing to offer this, or am I needing to offer like additional soil or something to that effect. And then of course, what materials and resources are available and what is affordable to you, because I like to think of compost as sort of like, it doesn't require, it is a wealth unto its own making. And so just considering those as you move forward in either constructing or improving a space that you're utilizing for compost. Next slide, please. So moisture, of course, is like the biggest deal. Water is almost always the heaviest concern. And so I sort of I did another presentation for a national group around this, and so it says you can use a roof or a tarp to protect from heavy rain. I would never suggest that for New Mexico, unless you're high in the mountains. That might be a different thing, but I personally would never cover my pile, and if I was going to cover my pile because of maybe less desirable organisms, I would use something that is like a screen or is permeable, so that moisture can get in there. A row cover, blankets would work even. Just something that will support maintaining moisture but wouldn't prevent moisture from entering. Or you can be one of those people who watches the weather not only for your garden but for your compost pile, and you keep it covered and you uncover it when you know moisture is coming. But call me, because I always feel like it's crazy unpredictable. And then the other thing I'm a really big fan of is really thick walls to prevent evaporation. And I think a lot of folks are big fans of pallets or wooden enclosures. And in my experience, that increases airflow, which means more evaporation, which means less hydric aspect, less water in our compost heap. So I've personally found, and I learned this from a worm composter in Santa Fe, the straw bales are amazing. They're pretty affordable. Here, they're more expensive than Taos, I've discovered, but they're pretty affordable, and they're a great and quick enclosure. And when you can use them as brown material, they're just very versatile, and they really support a moist environment, whether you're doing a hot compost, cold compost, or a vermicompost. People also use cinder block. I do like to use organic materials because then we know it's just going to end up in the pile. But next slide, please. So aeration is in a lot of composting communities, which I think a lot of those originate in more eastern climes or more moist climes. And I'm never encountering that there's a lack of air in people's compost piles. If anything, there's too much. But air is necessary for organisms. The idea of turning piles, mechanical aeration, has existed for a really long time. That was typically taking place in areas where there was heavy rains, and so there's a lot of compaction from moisture, those sorts of things. I don't really encounter that as a concern here, but aeration is good. So if it's an old pile or it's going to be a while, you can see some ideas there, like PVC piping. You can put in there with some holes in it, and it'll just like automatically generate circulation, or having or using like a screen of some kind or some kind of a mesh. But again, I don't typically encounter this as a concern, and air is very valuable for sure. And one of the ways that you can sort of know that there might be a need for aeration is if you sort of are sifting through your pile and there's a strong aroma coming out, like a real nasty aroma. That is usually a pretty good sign that there's maybe inadequate aeration, and you can even solve that by adding a layer of brown material, because that can also be too much nitrogen, just depending. Any questions so far? And please let me know if I'm talking too fast. I was just listening to my other presentation. I'm realizing what a rapid talker I can be sometimes. So yep, I think pallets are great. They're available everywhere. They're just really accessible, and even if you just put like 2 pallets side by side or something to that effect, you can really you can generate something very quickly. I would kind of encourage a 4-sided pallet structure instead of a 3-sided, just to sort of decrease wind evaporation. What is that called? Convection. But otherwise, they're a lovely thing. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, there's a bunch of cute palette pictures. Cool. And then container composting is again, not a huge fan of this unless it's worm composting and or it's in somebody's indoor space. But container composting typically lacks a lot of those things that a compost wants, meaning like adequate aeration and adequate moisture. And usually it's the opposite, it's too much moisture. But there's a lot of really cool designs out there that are in fact set up to sort of like increase aeration. And the most affordable of them all, of course, is a trash can. Just put some holes in there, life is good. But I do think what's sort of fun about like the 50-gallon drums or anything is it can be a game for the kids, so you can play like kick the can around an area or something. I'm a big fan of supporting children in mechanical decomposition, even though I myself would not do it. But the containers can be really supportive of that. Next slide, please. Trench composting. So I usually, when I'm working with youth, a big conversation I like to share is anybody can compost anywhere, and trench composting is totally the example of that. This is typically a cold composting process. You can literally just put anything, so long as it was once living, you put anything into a hole of some kind in the earth, and it will eventually return to its sort of basic elemental chemicals. And trench composting is a great way to do that. So that's if you have furrows, even ditches. I've seen where you can kind of see in the picture on the right, I've seen where someone sort of does a trench like that, and then the next year they would move their planting row on top of where that trench was and then generate a new trench to the side. So there's a lot of different fancy ways, especially if you're lacking for space. This is a great way to sort of like enhance fertility while also generating food. It's pretty cool. Next slide, please. Vermicompost, absolutely amazing. Definitely feels like it's on the trickier end for people. You would never think raising worms would be so tricky, but I think it can be. But they're amazing. These are sort of the two types of worms you would want to buy. Lots of people can buy earthworms or all these other worms, but worms, like so many other insect-like organisms, are very vast and diverse. And so there are two specific ones, that being the red wigglers and red worms. And their job, they don't live in the duff, which is what earthworms do. So they live in the leaves. They live just below, and I can't remember what that soil layer is called in fancy science language. But basically their entire job is to sort of eat up whatever material there is subsurface. So they're really big fans of having a mulch layer over top. So if we're putting food in there, they typically are going to want something over top of it so that they are hindered from the shade. That's why a lot of these worm castles, bins, etc. have a lid on them, but sort of I think it's much kinder to just put mulch over top of them, and then that way they're still having adequate aeration. I mostly see people drown their worms, which is totally possible, and or dry them out. So it is this fine balance between them. Some fun facts about worms: they eat their weight every day. They can digest radioactive material and sterilize toxic materials. They have 5 hearts. They're just an educator's dream as far as I'm concerned. And kids, I'm sure you all know, youth are slightly terrified and adoring of anything small and creepy crawly. Next slide, please.
Liana, I can't hear you again. There. Wait.
Oh.
Now I can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Will you go back to the last slide?
Yes.
Sorry. So windrow is basically, the idea was back in the day, they would just, let's say this is a food heap, I would put the next food heap next door to it and the next door to it, and I would make this row, and it would just be this open air compost. But I always knew that the newest material was over here and the oldest material was over here, sort of the idea. So with windrow vermicomposting, it's using the straw bales, and usually I'll find a wall. This is sort of, it'll be demonstrated in a later picture, but typically I'm going to take a straw bale's width, or cubic straw bale. That's going to be composting with the worms. Worms do need time to settle to sort of finish. So with the worms, it starts to look finished. Then I'm just moving the straw bales to the right or to the left or to the front or to the back, and I'm letting that pile sort of finish on its own. What's nice about this is, so long as I don't have a barrier between my worms as I move, I hope I'm explaining this, okay? As long as I'm moving the straw bales down appropriately, my worms will literally just move into the next pile. And this works with vermicomposting in New Mexico because we live in an arid region. So those worms are not interested in leaving your moist, awesome pile. They want to stay there. And I've seen one of the first worm composters I ever worked with. He was worm farming in the Mojave Desert in 115-degree weather and just had an open air pile of tires and rubber boots and all these things. And they were just, the worms would have at it, but they never left because that's where the water was. And so this is really similar. So with the windrow, you would do a similar thing. You would start it out. They typically like to have a strong carbon base. People like to use newspaper, paper clippings, moist with some soil. There's all these recipes out there you can, to start your worms, and then you can just start piling on top. And then it's really simple to move it along, and more on that later. Next slide. And this is just a little.
Liana, you cut out. Let's see. Oh, can't hear you. There you are.
Sorry.
That's all good. Don't be sorry. You're just starting from the top of this slide. Oops.
Oh, okay. Y'all didn't hear anything about tools and materials? Dang it. I was just saying this is a list, not conclusive, but just sort of a like possible things you could want to share composting with your youth or to start something up where you're at. And if anybody needs support on
You cut out again, Liana. Maybe if you, I don't know if turning your video off will help. Oh. Okay, I think we can hear you again.
Oh man, am I really going in and out?
Yeah, you might try turning your video off. That kind
Okay.
of helps sometimes. Yeah.
Cool. Can y'all hear me okay now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So sorry. Next slide, please. So, so we're going to sort of move into ways to connect this on an institutional level and also in educational formats. So, on that note, I just want us to venture and think and share as much as feels appropriate and drop anything in the chat or share aloud. But basically, we're going to start with a little video, and please forgive the videographer, which was me. This is like long before I had any clue how to work anything techie. And and also I'm not much better at this point, but yeah, I would love to watch this and just if as we're watching any thoughts come up about concerns or considerations, please do share. Thanks. Do you guys think that there'll be food leftovers today? No? You think there'll be food in the garbage? Yeah? What kind of food?
Salad.
You think salad? People don't like the salad?
I don't.
They don't like the green stuff? Do you think there will be a lot of food waste today? Yeah?
Not really.
Not because it's pizza, right? That's what everybody else is saying too. That's pretty funny. So what we'll do is we'll go to, when you're done, we'll go to the nurses and we'll get the scale and we'll bring the scale in here and then we'll weigh the food waste that way. Do you guys think there's gonna be a lot of food waste? Yeah, you think a lot? Like what's a lot? Do you guys ever think about that? No? Well, you're thinking about it. I'm really excited about that.
How much are we gonna weigh?
So we're just gonna weigh the food waste is your goal. If you have to weigh food waste for your project, how are we gonna figure out how to weigh just the food waste? So what do you think? So you wanna go through the garbage to figure out what's wasteful? Really? You're okay with that? Can we take from today's garbage? Yeah? Okay. Which one is that? Let's get that one. So we're going to see how much garbage. No, we're going to separate it first and then we'll weigh it. Does that sound good? So what we need to do without making a bigger mess is we need to put all the garbage in here and we're going to separate all the food waste out. Okay? And this is going to be tricky for sure. Nice. Okay, so we've got lettuce, we've got milk, we've got what else?
Different stuff?
Different
Milk.
stuff.
Wait. Wow! Oh my god, there's soup in here. Ravioli! Tray. Ew! That looks nasty!
Herman, he hasn't grown the stomach that you have. Almost 12. 12? Why don't we add 12 and 11? And we'll say that's our total. How much?
Hold on.
12 plus 11.
23.
You agree? Great. So we've had 20 pounds or more almost every day. Do you think it would be easy to separate the food trash from the rest of the trash?
Yeah.
Yeah? Who do you think could be responsible for that? For separating the food waste from the rest of the waste?
Me and him, huh?
Yeah? Would you guys want to do that every day? All day? Really? You like it that much? That's awesome. So you think it's totally possible that we could separate that out and then compost it?
Yeah.
Cool. And we said the food waste currently goes to a landfill. If this food waste went to the compost, it could make, and we need to find out a number pounds of soil. So how's our food waste that we're gonna be working on?
Do you have glitter stuff?
Glitter?
Yeah.
I love it. You want to do a food waste board that has glitter on it? That sounds very exciting. It'll be like a disco food waste. Yeah.
That was awesome.
I love those children so much.
I love how you just like totally, it was such a learning process for, them to take initiative and just be like, I love the idea of going through the trash first and just being like, how much food are we wasting? And asking those questions.
Especially
it says your bandwidth is low, Liana.
okay. Can y'all hear me okay right now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, cool. So sorry. Yeah, so I guess my question was just if anybody had any thoughts or considerations about having composting taking place at your site or institution, so we can sort of orient the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought the video was awesome. I loved what I saw and the engagement of the students and all of that. So I guess one question I have, we've been tending just to collect the vegetable scraps. Is it okay to collect anything and everything for the compost?
I think that's a really great and super common question, and thanks for appreciating the video. Thank you. Yeah, so I personally would say yes. If you believe that you might encounter resistance from anybody in your school that might hinder your program, then I think slowly segueing into other materials is fine. So I think that is more a cultural thing than so everything will compost. is what's real. And the vast majority, I mean, I pretty much believe that all school food is heavily cooked. So all of it will compost, including milk. And that is what we did at our site. We were collecting, there's a lot of dairy trash, dairy waste oftentimes. And then we would definitely have like cheese on pizza or leftover burgers or tenders. And it was usually so minimal, and it just was never a concern. If I were in an area where there's a lot of neighborhood dogs, or there's like a concern with wildlife coming in, I might feel less inclined to do that. So I would just say that's sort of your best judgment. But can you compost that stuff? Absolutely. And just whether or not you would want to is based on sort of your site and spaces concerns, and consider. There's a lot of biases around a lot of these things. But in reality, if it was living, it will decompose and it will compost. And especially in the context of cafeteria food, the vast majority of that is very cooked, that to the extent that it's not a concern.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, totally. Anybody else? Cool.
Liana,
Oh, go
I
ahead.
have a question about, do you have a recommendation for the best? I mean, obviously it kind of goes site by site, and you walk the campus and maybe figure out the best location for the compost. But do you have any like educational recommendations?
Yeah. I think the things I mostly think about is like, who's gonna see and smell this, and how are their attitudes about that. So if I am in like, I almost said something really offensive, I'm not going to do that. If I'm in like a very accepting of sort of like farm systems and food systems, school space, then I would sort of like put it front and center, because I feel like a compost pile is like worth highlighting in a garden space. If I'm in a place where there's like a lot of resistance to sort of like waste or rot, or which is all totally fine, I'm typically going to sort of like find a dark corner for that compost to be. And then from there, I think it is sort of reverting back to the, like desirable and less desirable organisms. Like in this picture, you can see we had quite the fence, and we're by two very busy roads where this school site was. So I was not really concerned about animals, and I wanted it this was essentially the furthest fence from the school inside the garden. If there is potential for water to run off into it, that might be a consideration I would want for my site. How big I want it to be. So in this photo at the Salazar Jardín, like that, where the kids are making their adorable faces, like that entire wall was covered in compost after a year of composting with them. So like that's another consideration, is just like, how big do you think your system is going to be? That's why I'm a little resistant also to the pallet systems, because they sort of keep you isolated, which is what some folks want. But in my experience in our region, we usually actually have more space than less space. I don't know if that's helping answer, but those are some of the considerations I would have.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. So yeah, so this slide is basically, just a quick note, I am a really big fan of asking kids to make their misery faces when I take pictures. And so this is some kindergartners doing a really good job of just like pretending to be really grossed out by the compost, I think was the setup for this photo. Anyways, so enculturation is really key to all of this. So like with anything, of course, like anticipating stuff is going to prevent future concerns, and then ideally promote that thing. And so things that we can readily anticipate, which I'm sure y'all encounter in yourselves and probably in co-faculty or in folks that are sort of taking care of various spaces at your school is biases. There's going to be really intense biases around food waste, and then also the realities of the risk. We want to sort of come at folks with these kinds of, whether it's data or something different, and then also anticipating the separation of liquid and solid. A lot of schools already have this system in place, so that's super helpful. And we want it to be really youth oriented. I feel like oftentimes when we sort of make it the staff's job, those projects sort of dissipate and we don't have enculturation, which is ideally what the entire objective is of a school. I was just at a school site that I had gone to 10 years ago, and they had this epic compost system, just enormous, and machinery and all of the things. And I was there a decade later, and they're basically like, it fell off because we made it the custodian, the maintenance team's job to do this, and the kids have no investment, and they had this entire system that just went away because it wasn't youth oriented. And as I'm sure all institutions know, sort of funding comes and goes, but like kids and culture and tradition are the social equity we can build off of, and that supports the sustaining. And then ways to enculturate. As was demonstrated in the video, we did a waste audit, which is like one of my favorite pastimes on the planet. So you get some brave kids. It doesn't have to be even like some brave kids with an audience of other youth, however it is. But waste audits are a great way to just be like, what is actually in our garbage? What of this could actually be turned into soil or not, which is pretty much virtually all of it. Categorizing those wastes, just sort of dissecting waste as a whole. Documenting is key. You notice we weighed with the kids. So of course we're starting to bring in standards, and I know lots of educators are huge fans, and also looking at it, but like documenting this process can be huge. Involving local community. I've been in spaces where folks actually have a compost drop off, and the school is sort of doing compost with the community to also support their involvement. And again, like building that social equity. Visiting waste sites is amazing. I think some of my favorite has been going to landfills with youth, and then like thinking about, especially if we have a functioning compost heap at the site, to just be able to be like, hey, it's our compost heap smells really good, not like the landfill. What could be done differently, systemically or locally? And then there's lots of really cool media these days, especially through the pandemic. I just feel like people are just like pumping out amazing media to educate and to engage around food waste and compost and all those things. Lots of really fun songs. We had youth oftentimes signing up. It was very much like a reward for them to participate. It was kind of all over the place depending on which classroom I was dealing with. But anyways, so yeah, just making it kind of an official process, or like a special space or a school-wide space, but definitely keeping it out of sort of like discipline and obligation and into like celebration and participation. Mechanical decomposition. I shared this earlier, but just like handing kids some sort of hand tool and just like letting them go to town, especially anybody, even you, experiencing a sucky day with like a shovel and a pile of compost and just stabbing it. It's so good. And just understanding that yes, we can, and that this process is very much like a little by little, but it's certainly doable and does make change. Other things to think about is just like collecting that waste thoughtfully, as we shared, sort of separating liquids and solids. Buckets are amazing. They're usually readily available, really easy to clean, really easy to sterilize. I think having a transportation plan is really ideal. And as you saw, the effort was really to remove the the nutrition staff and the custodial staff from the process, but that also meant them having youth or having a faculty member that they would trust to sort of support the youth going through. And we did need to do that for several weeks, and sometimes would sort of come back in. So I think having a little bit of oversight, but of course supporting that sort of like solidarity and capacity among youth. And then also what the plan is for processing it. I would run into circumstances where kids would just like walk the buckets to the pile and like not put them in there, and I'd find them after a weekend and, you know, they're really disgusting sitting in a bucket kind of a thing. So just the just making sure that those steps are also being enculturated. And then of course, like reducing, using, and recycling all the resources that we have available, and just being really inventive, which I think anytime we sort of open up a waste into a resource, it is one of the most resourceful spaces. And familiarizing yourself with OSHA, not the plant, although that'd be awesome too, but just that organization will sort of give you an understanding of some of the concerns. But for the most part, the same idea as you would take trash to a dumpster, taking food waste to a compost. There's not a lot around it, and it's just your normal sanitary processes. And if your pile stinks, just like adding brown material, more managing it there. But otherwise, you're probably making it much more safe, honestly, by like not having trash cans full of rotting food inside of structures. And then relationship building is prevention, like projects if possible. Whatever meetings you can set up, whatever meetings you can attend and organize, talking with folks frequently. Everybody, I like engage with everybody. I like read their signals about how they feel about all this stuff because there's a lot of people who are really into it. There's a lot of people who are really out of it. And then there's like a weird competition, but that's not necessarily because we all want this to work really well. And just especially being really thoughtful of like custodial maintenance and nutrition folks, even to the extent that just like preemptively saying like, what do you think of this? Any considerations? Like, want to do this good? Making an open line of communication, those sorts of things I think are really vital. Any questions or comments about that stuff? Cool. Next slide, please. So this is, let me see if I can copy this. This is essentially I just sent y'all this folder also in the chat. But basically, these are my favoriteest activities. So almost 20 years of doing work around compost. Like these are my like always strategic, always helpful, in sort of building relationship to compost and composting. And so I did sort of an example active in classroom home activities, because I know there are a lot of virtual youth. I know like the vast majority of the youth I'm working with currently are virtual, and then also some more project-based ideas. So the first activity that I have on that slide is a compost tag. Sorry, I just had a wasp fly at my face. And compost tag, if anybody has, I'm a huge fan of like physical activity, but compost tag is essentially decomposer tag with like a composting twist. This is thank you, Kasturi. So this is a nice write-up of it. I'm sure they are much more thorough than I am, but basically the premise is I do round one. In round one, there are kids who are food and there are kids who are people. If the people tag the food does not go back into the system. The food will just sit down because it's out of the game, because whatever remains of the food or whatever sort of waste came from making that food is going to a landfill, and we never reuse anything from landfills. Never is a strong word, but basically almost never, or almost always.
We lost you, Liana. I think so. Might just.
continue. I saw it that time.
For a second, sorry. Are you?
No, it's okay. I saw it that time. Am I okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. Sometimes it tells me, sometimes it doesn't. Basically the following round would be if we were able to take that food waste and recycle it back to produce soil, and soil is part of the sauce on air, water. Soil, produces a plant, and plants feed animals, and animals feed other animals, yada yada. Food chain, so many lessons in there. Anyways, but basically we end up with a compost superhero or superheroes, and their job is to run around and sort of tag back in those food children who have taken a cedar out of the game. And it's a very exhausting game. It basically goes on forever, which is the objective. And that's how we talk about the concept of like recycling and cycles of life and death and yada yada. So that's a really fun active game. In classroom, and especially what you were talking about, Susan, is I've done yucky and yummy compost relays. If people still have access to like a plethora of magazines, or this could even be done, virtually really readily, but I'll just have kids go through and like cut out pictures of food, for instance, and just like make this cache of food photos, or they could write the names of foods they like to eat, anything, and you could build up this little cache. And then I hope all of us still remember how to play relay games, but basically setting up a relay game, and they would grab a picture or a word out of the cache, and they would stick it in the yucky or the yummy for worms, or stick it to the board under yucky or yummy, or in a jar that says yucky or yummy, something to that effect. Or if you're doing this virtually, just having them sort of setting up a jam board and then like making a yucky and yummy, and they can do Google image searches of the foods they love and then place them in places. And it's a good way to sort of get the conversation started. And then, of course, to sort of have the conversation of everything does decompose if it was once living. And then typically with worms, especially if they're inside your classroom, not necessarily true outside, you're typically going to avoid meat and dairy and excess coffee are some of the main ones, or citrus, just things that can be really potent if they're in high volume. But it's a great way to start that conversation, and that there's certain ingredients and yada yada yada. So yucky yummy compost relays. And then home activities, do it yourself at home compost. There's so many versions of this. I think there is in that folder also, to just like have kids dig a hole and bury food, come back and check it in a week, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks. Have them try to make a mini worm compost. I've seen folks do this with like a yogurt container, something to that effect. Also, home audits can be really cool for food waste, just supporting them and sort of acknowledging what it is that they're throwing out or not throwing out, or what it's being used for, if it could be used in other ways. And then project-based, there's just so much. The food waste audit, like we shared earlier, and then any kind of waste management projects are just, they're incredibly project-based and can be as intricate or not. And especially with upper grade levels, this is a great way to just sort of, I had the kids in the video that was their science project for the year, and as a result it created an entire system. And that school, to my understanding, still to this day has that compost organization. So sorry, my brain is fading a little bit. Any questions about those activities? Cool. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm excited to share those. We have a tab on the School Garden Resource Finder. I'd love to add this there.
Oh yeah, anything, please do.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank you all so much, and that by us sharing this conversation, we're ideally supporting this generation and the next generations to support the next generation. I also work in anti-oppression, and one of my favorite combos we often have is like, what is our 200-year plan? So like, how do we generate, or how do we think about the future in such a way that we are setting up and supporting a society and a future that we're excited for, and how do we just keep conveying that dream as well as those realities. And this really adorable picture on the right side is one of the youth that I work with, and this is her little nephew, and she's showing him how to compost, how to add brown material. And so just a friendly reminder that the cycle keeps going and going, much as compost does. And that's my information. Y'all are welcome to contact me anytime, any day, anyway. I love supporting these processes, and and we'll welcome any questions, comments, emotional outbursts, needs to leave, etc. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I just really appreciate all the information and good ideas. You know, I will probably be in contact with you if you don't mind.
I would, yes, please do. I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know that Megan was asking at the beginning about like policies that have to do with composting in schools. Are either of you, Liana and Susan, as people who have done this in schools, do you have any wisdom on that?
I do not. I felt like it was a very undocumented activity. I think in the same way that the sort of, like we take the trash out at this day, and that like a lot of that stuff isn't documented. I feel like compost often falls that way in my experience. And there wasn't, if anything, there was sort of a resistance to documentation, I think, because they felt like if they were making it official, then that might sort of generate a kerfuffle or a concern that didn't necessarily seem necessary.
Definitely hear that. A lot of the garden stuff is tricky in that way, right? I know that food and nutrition allows compost, right, Susan?
Yeah.
You can't.
But again, there are no real guidelines. We've just kind of picked up from what Mary, who was there previously, was doing, and just haven't asked too many questions because we're a little bit afraid, they might shut us down or something. And I think, doing it the way we do it, where we're just using the fruit and vegetable waste, and then, the brown with it, seems to be okay with everyone. Nobody has ever questioned what we're doing.
Wonderful. I think definitely there's ways to like move into it, right? Like starting small with maybe moving eventually to the idea of like everything is compostable, which is something I embrace, but like starting with the fruit and the veg scrap. And also just what I heard from this presentation too is like really it's about learning, and yes, there's a larger transformation that happens, if we get back to the cycles of the earth and embracing those within the institution. But just it being a student-led process, I think. Like at Albuquerque Academy, they have one of their clubs, the environmental club, I think, that's in charge of the composting. So they really are like monitoring exactly what goes in, and they're taking initiative to kind of go and dump and turn the compost. It really is a whole job.
Definitely. And that's somebody I've talked to a lot, and they've had trouble sort of maintaining those systems because they sort of have like enthusiasm and loss of enthusiasm, or administration gets involved, and then the kids are sort of removed from the process, and then that response. So yeah, just making backup systems to the system seems like a good way to sort of support continuity.
Does anyone else have any other ideas about this?
Just out of curiosity, do you have any idea about bioreactors and using them as a system for creating compost, Liana?
I don't, and I actually just heard that term when I was talking to the garden teacher at Albuquerque Academy. They just got like 3 of them. And what she shared, her name is Heidi Anderson. And she was basically like, they're $70 delivered, super affordable, but I don't really know much else beyond that. But yeah, she is totally down to have conversations with folks about that. And I had told her I would be presenting, and she's like, oh, let people know if they ask. And so thanks for that. But I honestly don't know what a bioreactor is. I have a lot to learn. Kateri or Megan, do y'all have any thoughts?
I actually have one right here in my yard. I don't know if you could see, but over there, Susan.
Yeah, okay, all right.
I just
So
thought, do you have some too, right?
Yeah, we have something similar to that. And we're kind of at that point now, you know, do we dismantle it and start over again, or, you know, how do we know when it's done and ready, you know, because when we dig down inside, we have some very nice black dirt, but it's not 100% decomposed yet. And ours is just a homemade one.
Yes, mine too. How many months has it been in there?
It's been there almost a year now.
Wow, it's probably I've heard like 8 or 9 months, but you know what's great is there's an event coming up with David Johnson, Dr. Johnson, who's like the guy who
the guy
spearheaded, the bioreactor.
What's that? It's called Sue Johnson or something like that.
Yeah, I think David Johnson bioreactor or something. But let's see. This is him. So there's actually, oh, I guess it's today. It's right after this at 5:30.
Oh, of course.
I know, if you want to jump on another call, but the link is here on the APS website on the school gardens page under upcoming events. And if you don't feel like jumping on it right after this, because it would be cool to ask him that question, he's doing another event, which is tomorrow at 6 p.m.
Tomorrow would work better for me. And that's all listed on the